It wasn't a battle. It wasn't a speech. It was a deal struck in back rooms, one quiet compromise in 1877 that ended Reconstruction, pulled federal troops from the South, and shaped the next 150 years of American life. From that moment of uneasy peace, the United States would face every turning point. Its constitution tested by civil war, its democracy reinvented by waves of immigrants, its ideals challenged by depression, world wars, civil rights struggles, and the dawn of the digital age. To understand America today, its divisions and its dreams, you have to see the whole journey, from a patchwork of colonies to a global superpower. This is the entire history of the United States, told not as a textbook timeline, but as a living drama of choices, conflicts, and reinventions that continue to shape the nation's soul. A Taino elder stands on the sand at Guanahani in 1492, holding out a carved wooden idol as the tall masted ships draw close. He does not know that within a generation 9 of every 10 of his people will be gone. The American story does not begin with a flag or a constitution. It begins with two worlds colliding. For thousands of years before Columbus, the continents of the Western Hemisphere were alive with cities and trade. The Mississippian mound builders of Cahokia, whose plazas rivaled the squares of medieval Europe, the Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, forging confederacies in the forests of the Northeast, the Pueblo peoples who had mastered dry land farming in the Southwest. They hunted, farmed, traded copper, shells, and obsidian across a vast continental web. Across the Atlantic, by the late 15th century, European kingdoms were clawing out of the Middle Ages, hungry for spice routes, gold, and souls. Portugal's caravels probed the African coast. Spain, newly united under Ferdinand and Isabella, looked west. In October 1492, the two hemispheres touched. The Columbian Exchange began, not just of goods, but of diseases, faiths, languages, and empires. Within decades, smallpox, measles, and influenza swept the Caribbean and the mainland, emptying towns long before European settlers arrived. Entire regions were depopulated. The balance of power among native nations shifted violently. Spanish adventurers built outposts in the Caribbean, Florida, and the Southwest. French traders moved down the St. Lawrence, seeking beaver pelts and native alliances. In the far north, English fishermen worked Newfoundland banks before the first colonies were planted. By 1607, when Jamestown was founded, the New World was already a transformed world, its ecological and demographic foundations upended. What the English encountered was not a timeless wilderness but a continent in the aftermath of catastrophe, where native nations were regrouping, forging new alliances, still commanding vast territories. The collision of 1492 was not a single moment of discovery. It was the opening of a centuries-long negotiation, sometimes in treaties, often in war, over who would control the land, the labor, and the future. America's epic begins not with a birth, but with a shockwave. Winter, 1609. In Jamestown, the river ice drags at the hull of the ships. Inside the fort, gaunt men boil shoe leather for soup. The starving time claims 7 of every 10 settlers. Beyond the palisade, the Powhatan Confederacy watches, cautious, calculating. The English came to Virginia chasing gold. They found instead swamps, mosquitoes, and the hard fact that they needed native farmers' corn to survive. The Jamestown experiment barely held together, propped up by supplies from home and by uneasy trade with Powhatan's people. Yet out of this fragile beachhead grew a new order: tobacco. By the 1620s, the sweet leaf had become Europe's addiction and Virginia's lifeline. To plant and cut and cure it demanded hands, more than the dwindling indentured servants could provide. In 1619, a Dutch privateer sold 20 and odd captive Africans to Virginia planters. What began as a marginal labor source would become the backbone of a plantation economy. The hunger for land pushed settlers outward. Treaties were broken, fields and villages burned, retaliations escalated. In New England, the Puritans landed in 1620 seeking a city upon a hill, a godly commonwealth. They too survived their first winter by native aid, then expanded across Wampanoag and Pequot lands. In the mid-1600s, the colonies multiplied: Dutch at New Amsterdam, Swedes on the Delaware, French in Canada. Alongside trade in furs and timber grew new tensions between colonists and imperial governors, between frontier farmers and native nations, between free laborers and wealthy planters. The flashpoint came in 1676. Nathaniel Bacon, a restless planter, rallied poor farmers and former servants to march on the colonial capital, demanding more war on surrounding tribes and less privilege for the governor's circle. The rebellion burned Jamestown itself before collapsing, but it terrified the elite. To keep the lower classes from uniting again, the colonial gentry hardened racial lines, shifting more fully to African slavery and away from indentured European labor. Thus, even before independence, class and race were welded into the politics of the colonies. A pattern had been set: promises of liberty for some, coercion for others. The ashes of Jamestown's wooden palisades smoldered under the Virginia sun. In them lay the first sparks of a distinctly American dissent against distant rulers, against unequal privilege that would flare again and again. February 1692. In a snowbound Massachusetts village, a minister's niece convulses and screams of witches. Within months, 19 people swing from gallows beams. Across the Atlantic, philosophers draft treatises on reason and natural rights. America's next transformation will be fought not on battlefields but in minds and pulpits. The late 17th century colonies were no longer a fragile experiment. Tobacco and rice plantations lined the southern rivers. Boston bustled with merchants and shipwrights. The interior was still contested ground between native nations, colonial settlers, and French traders. But beneath the growing wealth, an argument over how the world worked took hold. Puritan orthodoxy, shaped by fear of sin and divine wrath, clashed with new currents from Europe, the Enlightenment, where men like John Locke declared that governments drew power from the consent of the governed, and natural laws explained the universe without sorcery. The Salem witch panic revealed a society still chained by old fears. The aftermath, when judges and ministers admitted they had erred, helped push New England's elite toward more rational methods of evidence and law. By the 1720s and 1730s, a different wave surged through the colonies, the First Great Awakening. It was emotional, even theatrical. Preachers such as Jonathan Edwards warned of sinners hanging by a slender thread over the pit of hell. George Whitefield, a booming-voiced English evangelist, rode on horseback from town to town, gathering tens of thousands in open-air meetings. This revival cut across class and colony lines. It empowered ordinary men and women, sometimes even enslaved Africans, to testify and demand moral reform. It seeded an idea that authority could be challenged by the conscience of the common believer. In port cities, meanwhile, printers multiplied newspapers and pamphlets. Almanacs and essays carried not just shipping notices but debates on science, philosophy, and self-government. Franklin's kite experiment and his civic clubs became symbols of curiosity and civic improvement. Out of the clash of faith and reason, fear and inquiry, the colonists forged a culture that prized both liberty of conscience and lively debate. These habits, printing, preaching, questioning, would prove as decisive as muskets when the quarrel with empire came. A lightning bolt strikes a New England steeple as a press below thumps out another pamphlet. The colonies are no longer only provinces of Europe, they are becoming a public of ideas. May 1754. A young, ambitious Virginian officer named George Washington, just 22, leads colonial militia into the misty forests of the Ohio Valley. A skirmish breaks out with French troops, shots fired in a ravine. The clash is small, but it will ignite a global conflict. At the dawn of the 1750s, North America was not yet an English continent. France claimed the vast interior, from the St. Lawrence down the Mississippi to New Orleans. Spain still held Florida and the Southwest. Britain's settlers clustered mainly along the Atlantic coast. Native nations, the Haudenosaunee, Shawnee, Delaware, Cherokee, were not passive spectators. They were powerful players, balancing rival European empires to protect their own homelands. The competition for the fertile Ohio Valley was the fuse. Britain's land companies and settlers wanted to expand westward. France, linking Canada to Louisiana by forts and trade routes, resisted. Both courted the native confederacies whose alliances could tip the balance. Washington's opening skirmish and the disastrous British defeat at Fort Necessity pulled London into a formal war with France. The conflict soon spread far beyond the Ohio forests, across the Atlantic to Europe, the Caribbean, West Africa, even India. Historians call it the 7 Years' War. In the colonies, it was remembered as the French and Indian War. British regulars under General Braddock marched into the wilderness in bright red coats, only to be ambushed near the Monongahela in 1755. For several years, frontier settlements were raided and burned, but by 1759 British arms prevailed. Quebec fell after the daring assault on the Plains of Abraham. Montreal surrendered the next year. France ceded Canada and most of its claims east of the Mississippi. Britain emerged as the dominant power in North America, but victory came at a staggering cost, an empire deep in debt. To pay for garrisons and wars, Parliament would soon tax the colonies more directly, and the very troops who had fought side by side would begin to quarrel over who owed what to whom. A cannon thunders above the frozen St. Lawrence as Union Jack banners rise over Quebec's cliffs. The war is won, but in its wake, a new conflict brews between empire and its colonists. March 5, 1770. A snowy Boston night, British sentries surrounded by jeering townsfolk. A musket discharges, then another. When the smoke clears, 5 colonists lie dead on the cobblestones. Paul Revere will etch the scene as a massacre, and the image will speed from one seaport to another, ink and outrage on the same sheet of paper. The seeds of revolution were sown not in grand speeches, but in arguments over money, power, and respect. After the costly 7 Years' War, London expected its colonies, now more secure and prosperous, to share the burden of imperial defence. Parliament's Sugar Act, 1764, and Stamp Act, 1765, taxed everyday items, paper, contracts, newspapers. To London, these were modest levies. To colonists, they felt like a breach of the long-standing habit of self-taxation by local assemblies. Street protests erupted, lawyers refused to stamp their documents, merchants boycotted British goods, mobs in Boston hanged an effigy of the stamp distributor from a liberty tree until he resigned. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," condensed a deeper grievance. Colonists saw themselves as loyal Britons, but Parliament treated them as subjects to be ordered, not citizens to be consulted. When Parliament repealed the Stamp Act but passed new townshend duties, 1767, on tea, glass and paper, the resistance grew more organised. Committees of correspondence linked towns across New England. Women formed Daughters of Liberty circles to spin homespun cloth and boycott imports. The killing in Boston in 1770 turned resentment into fury. Though the soldiers were later defended in court by John Adams and mostly acquitted, the event lived on in pamphlets and tavern talk as proof of imperial tyranny. In 1773, Parliament granted the East India Company a monopoly on tea. Colonists saw it as another insult. That December, men disguised as Mohawks boarded ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. London struck back with the coercive acts, closing the harbor, stripping Massachusetts of self-government. Other colonies, alarmed, sent delegates to a Continental Congress in 1774 to coordinate resistance. The quarrel had shifted from taxes to sovereignty. The empire insisted on Parliament's supremacy. The colonies claimed the ancient English right of self-rule. In a candlelit hall in Philadelphia, delegates signed their names to a bold petition. Outside, riders wait with saddled horses to carry the news across a continent on the brink of war. April 19, 1775. Dawn mist over the village green at Lexington, Massachusetts. A line of colonial militiamen, farmers in homespun, face rows of red-coated British regulars. A single shot cracks the still air. No one will ever know who fired first, but the world will remember it as the shot heard round the world. The skirmish at Lexington and Concord turned a political quarrel into armed rebellion. Within weeks, thousands of New Englanders laid siege to British-held Boston. At Bunker Hill, they stood their ground behind earthen redoubts, firing until their powder was spent. The British won the hill, but at shocking cost, proof the colonials would fight hard. That same summer, the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia appointed George Washington to lead a Continental Army. He arrived to find a force of farmers and shopkeepers with more courage than gunpowder. Through bitter winters, especially at Valley Forge in 1777 to 78, he held the army together, drilling raw recruits into disciplined soldiers. On July 4, 1776, the Congress adopted Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Its soaring claim that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights, would inspire generations, even as slavery and exclusion endured in the new republic. For 2 years, the war went badly for the rebels, but in 1777, at Saratoga, an entire British army surrendered. The victory convinced France to ally with the Americans, sending fleets, troops, and gold. The war became global. The final act came in 1781 at Yorktown, Virginia. A French fleet sealed the Chesapeake Bay. Washington and French General Rochambeau trapped Lord Cornwallis's army. On October 19th, the British laid down their arms to the sound of fifes playing "The World Turned Upside Down." 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris, 1783, recognized the independence of the United States, stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. A colonial protest had become a full-fledged revolution, proving that a people could break from empire and found a nation on political ideals. As fireworks light the night above Philadelphia, a lone drummer boy gazes at the sparks and wonders what kind of republic these ideals will truly build. The struggle for liberty is won, yet the struggle to define it has only begun. December 23, 1783. In the Maryland State House, General George Washington bows before Congress and surrenders his military commission. Monarchs rarely relinquish power. By laying down his sword, Washington gives the newborn republic its first lesson in civilian rule. The Revolutionary War had freed the colonies from Britain, but it left behind a fragile confederation. 13 semi-sovereign states bound by the loose Articles of Confederation. Congress could not levy taxes, it could barely pay soldiers or foreign debts. The new nation was drowning in IOUs, its army often unpaid and restive. Farmers in western Massachusetts, crushed by taxes and debt, rose up in Shays' Rebellion, 1786. Courthouses were seized, and the state militia barely suppressed the revolt. To many leaders, it was a warning. Liberty without order could end in chaos. In 1787, delegates from the states gathered in the hot, shuttered hall of Philadelphia's Constitutional Convention. What began as a plan to revise the Articles became an audacious project to create a new federal government, stronger than before but still checked by law. Debates raged over representation, big states versus small, over slavery, over executive power. The final document balanced power between national and state governments, separated branches, and promised a Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties. By 1789, the United States Constitution was ratified, and Washington became the first president. He set precedents for a republic, serving only 2 terms, assembling a cabinet, suppressing the Whiskey Rebellion, not as a tyrant, but as a lawful executive. The nation's capital moved to the banks of the Potomac, a new city rising on a swampy plain. The 1790s tested the fragile Union. Hamilton's fiscal plan bound state debts to national credit, but deepened political divides. Parties formed, Federalists versus Democratic Republicans, fighting over the balance between central power and agrarian liberty. Foreign wars between Britain and revolutionary France threatened to pull the young republic apart. Washington's farewell address warned against entangling alliances and partisan rancor. Out of post-war debt, regional suspicion, and ideological argument, the United States hammered out a framework that could bend without breaking. The idea of peaceful transfer of power, unthinkable in most of the 18th century world, became the Republic's proudest invention. March 4, 18011. Thomas Jefferson takes the oath as president after a bitterly contested election. The revolution has come full circle. Power changes hands not by sword or coup, but by ballots and law. The American experiment is underway. its survival still uncertain. April 30th, 1803. In a candle-lit Paris chamber, American envoys sign a treaty with Napoleon Bonaparte. For $15 million, about 4 cents an acre, the United States doubles its territory overnight. President Thomas Jefferson, once a strict constitutional minimalist, gambles on the Louisiana Purchase. The dawn of the 19th century saw the young republic bursting at its seams. Jefferson envisioned an empire of liberty, a vast federation of independent farmers spreading westward, carrying republican ideals with them. Yet that expansion came at the expense of other nations, native and European alike. In 1804, Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark up the Missouri River to explore the new lands and seek a path to the Pacific. Guided in part by Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman, their expedition mapped rivers, catalogued wildlife, and claimed diplomatic contact with dozens of indigenous nations. But their reports also encouraged waves of settlers and speculators. For the indigenous peoples of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, westward expansion meant dispossession. Shawnee leader Tecumseh and his brother, the prophet Tenskwatawa, tried to rally a broad native confederacy to resist the land rush. Their dream was shattered in 1811 at the Battle of Tippecanoe, and again during the War of 1812, when Tecumseh, allied with the British, fell in battle. The War of 1812, often called America's Second War of Independence, tested the fragile Union. British forces burned Washington in 1814, yet American resilience at Baltimore and victory under Andrew Jackson at New Orleans gave the Republic new confidence and cemented a sense of national identity. In the post-war era of good feelings, the United States accelerated westward migration. Steamboats churned the Mississippi. Cotton cultivation surged in the Deep South, tying expansion ever more tightly to the labor of enslaved Africans. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise revealed the deepening fault line. Congress balanced Missouri as a slave state against Maine as a free state and drew a line across the continent to contain the institution. Liberty and land were pulling in opposite directions. The Republic's growth brought both opportunity and contradiction, fulfilling Jefferson's agrarian vision while entrenching the inequality he feared. Expansion turned the United States from a coastal republic into a continental power, but at a rising human cost. A steamboat whistles at dawn as settlers' wagons creak westward. Beyond the horizon lies promise for some, peril for others. The struggle over whose liberty would define the nation has only begun. March 4th, 1829. Crowds surge over the muddy streets of Washington, D.C. to witness the swearing-in of Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans. The celebration spills into the White House itself, guests climbing on chairs, china smashed, punch bowls drained. For admirers, it is the dawn of a new democratic age. For critics, it is the mob come to power. The election of 1828 marked the rise of mass politics. Property requirements for voting were falling, newspapers multiplied, political parties learned to mobilize rallies, songs, and slogans. Jackson, a rough-hewn frontier general, cast himself as champion of the common man against the entrenched elites of the East. Yet Jackson's vision of the common man was narrow. While he celebrated the white frontier farmer, he distrusted bankers, distrusted federal control of the economy, and despised native nations standing in the way of expansion. His bank war, the veto of the Second Bank of the United States, pitted him against financial and political rivals, reshaping the nation's fiscal order. Nowhere was his populism more brutal than in the policy of Indian removal. Determined to open fertile southern lands to cotton planters, Jackson pushed Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act, 1830. Despite legal victories in the Supreme Court affirming Cherokee sovereignty, the administration forced the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole peoples off their ancestral lands. Thousands died on the forced marches westward, remembered as the Trail of Tears. Meanwhile, in the expanding cotton frontier, the demand for enslaved labor intensified. The cotton gin had made short-staple cotton profitable on vast new lands, binding the economy of the South ever more tightly to slavery. Jackson's opponents, first the National Republicans, then the Whigs, warned that his populist appeals masked a dangerous concentration of executive power. Political cartoons showed him crowned as King Andrew I. The Jacksonian Age widened political participation for white men while deepening the dispossession of native nations and the bondage of African Americans. Democracy for some was purchased at the expense of others. In a clearing along the Arkansas River, a Cherokee elder buries a handful of Georgia soil wrapped in cloth. In Washington, the president rides past cheering crowds. Two visions of the Republic, expansion and justice, drift ever further apart. 1793. In a Georgia workshop, Eli Whitney demonstrates a wooden device that tears sticky seeds from short staple cotton. Planters cheer. Cotton can now be cleaned 10 times faster. None of them yet grasp that this simple machine will entrench human bondage across half a continent. The cotton gin transformed America's southern economy. Land once deemed marginal for tobacco suddenly became a white gold frontier, stretching from the Carolinas through Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and into Texas. Riverboats carried bales down the Mississippi to the ports of New Orleans and Mobile. Ships sailed for Liverpool to feed Britain's hungry textile mills. This cotton kingdom fueled explosive national growth, yet its engine was the labor of enslaved African Americans. Between 1790 and 1860, the enslaved population swelled from under 700,000 to nearly 4 million. Families were torn apart by the domestic slave trade as men, women, and children were sold down the river from the Upper South to new plantations in the Deep South. Northern merchants profited as well, financing cotton exports, insuring slave ships, spinning southern fiber in New England mills. Prosperity and bondage were entwined in a single national economy. At the same time, voices of resistance and abolition gained force. Escaped slaves like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth told their stories, challenging the conscience of a republic that celebrated liberty while sustaining slavery. Networks of safe houses and secret routes, the Underground Railroad, helped thousands flee northward. Congress sought compromise to keep the Union intact. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 balanced free and slave states. Later, the Compromise of 1850, crafted by Henry Clay, admitted California as free while strengthening the Fugitive Slave Act, forcing Northerners to aid in returning runaways, an act that inflamed sectional anger. Industrialization was beginning to change the North, factories, railroads, urban growth, while the South clung to its agrarian, slave-based wealth. The divide was no longer just regional, it was becoming ideological. The cotton gin promised progress, but it bound the nation more tightly to the chains of slavery. America's rise as an economic power deepened the contradiction between its ideals and its reality. On a moonless night beside the Ohio River, a freedom seeker hides beneath a flatboat's tarpaulin. Miles to the south, a steamboat stacked high with cotton bales drifts toward New Orleans, two currents in the same river, carrying a nation toward an unavoidable collision. May 1837. In New York City, anxious crowds press against the doors of the Manhattan Company Bank. Clerks slide silver coins through narrow windows as fast as they can. Rumors swirl that the vaults are nearly empty. Panic spreads like wildfire. Merchants go under, farms are seized, workers wander the streets without pay. The country has stumbled into one of its first great financial crises. The Panic of 1837 was the bust that followed the Jacksonian boom. During the 1830s, cheap credit, easy land sales, and soaring cotton prices had fueled a fever of speculation. Jackson's war on the National Bank and his order that land be bought with hard coin rather than paper notes burst that bubble. As British banks tightened credit, the fragile system collapsed. Unemployment spiked, breadlines formed in northern cities, farmers in the West lost their homesteads. The crisis revealed how interwoven the young republic's fortunes had become. Cotton in the South, finance in the North, settlers on the frontier, all lashed to the same economic tides. Politics in the era turned on promises of prosperity and accusations of corruption. Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren, struggled through the Depression, while the opposition Whig Party rose by denouncing the Democrats' spoils system of rewarding party loyalists with government jobs. In 1840, they staged the first mass-market presidential campaign, parades, songs, log cabin floats, to elect William Henry Harrison, the hero of Tippecanoe. Harrison's early death and the fractious presidency of John Tyler showed how fragile political coalitions could be. Yet even amid turmoil, the Republic expanded. Immigrants, Irish fleeing famine, Germans fleeing revolution, streamed into the cities of the North, adding both labor and political clout. Railroads began to knit regions together. A young congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln served a single term, quietly studying the tensions that would one day define his career. The decade taught Americans that democracy alone could not shield them from the boom and bust swings of a capitalist economy. It also showed that national politics was becoming a contest for mass opinion, waged with symbols, slogans, and spectacle, a harbinger of modern campaigning. As dusk settles over Wall Street, a lamplighter moves from post to post. In the fading glow, shuttered storefronts bear out-of-business signs, while newspaper boys shout headlines about another bank's collapse. The Republic learns that ambition without regulation can shake even its strongest institutions. April 25, 1846. A patrol of U.S. dragoons clashes with Mexican cavalry north of the Rio Grande. President James K. Polk seizes the moment, declaring that American blood has been shed on American soil. Congress votes for war. An expansionist republic has cast its eyes on half a continent. The phrase manifest destiny, coined by a newspaper editor, captured the mood of the 1840s, a belief that the United States was fated, even divinely appointed, to span from Atlantic to Pacific. But what was proclaimed as destiny would be purchased in blood and controversy. The decade had begun with a bold diplomatic coup. In 1845, the United States annexed the Republic of Texas, provoking Mexico, which still claimed the territory. At the same time, settlers by the thousands trudged the Oregon Trail, wagons creaking over plains and mountains in search of new farmland. The Mexican-American War proved swift, yet brutal. U.S. forces under Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott seized northern Mexico, marched to Veracruz, and fought their way to Mexico City. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the war, forcing Mexico to cede vast lands: California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. The United States had achieved its dream of continental reach. Gold was discovered in the Sierra Nevada in 1848. By 1849, the California gold rush drew fortune seekers from every continent. Boomtowns sprang up overnight. Native lands were overrun, rivers choked with silt and mercury from mining. Yet every mile of new territory reopened the question that haunted the Republic. Would slavery spread westward? The Wilmot Proviso of 1846, seeking to ban slavery in the new lands, passed the House but failed in the Senate, an omen of battles to come. California's request for admission as a free state would soon provoke a sectional crisis. Manifest destiny enlarged the map but deepened the divide. Expansion brought opportunity and wealth, but also dispossession of indigenous peoples, conquest of a neighboring republic, and the spreading shadow of the slavery debate. At sunset, a line of covered wagons crests the Rockies as miners stream toward the California hills. Far to the south, in a quiet Mexican village, families mourn the sons lost to a war fought in the name of another nation's destiny. The American dream of westward empire has exacted its first great price. October 1850. A chill dawn in Boston. Federal marshals march a captured fugitive slave through crowded streets back to a waiting ship. Church bells toll in protest. For the first time, many Northerners feel the hand of slavery reach into their own cities. The victory over Mexico had added a vast new empire of Western lands, but the question of slavery's expansion threatened to tear the Union apart. Congress tried to quiet the quarrel with the Compromise of 1850. California entered as a free state. The slave trade was ended in the nation's capital. But a far harsher Fugitive Slave Act compelled citizens everywhere to help capture escapees. The law radicalized the North. A formerly enslaved man named Frederick Douglass filled halls with fiery oratory. The novel Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe sold hundreds of thousands of copies, humanizing the suffering of the enslaved. defiant Northerners built the Underground Railroad into a lifeline to Canada. In the Prairie Lands, a new party, the Republicans, was born in 1854 out of outrage at the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which let settlers vote on whether to permit slavery, repealing the old Missouri Compromise line. The result was Bleeding Kansas, armed clashes between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers that previewed the coming national conflict. In 1857, the Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court declared that Congress had no power to bar slavery in the territories and that black people could not be citizens. Abolitionists were enraged. Slaveholders felt vindicated. 2 years later, a gaunt, bearded New Englander named John Brown raided the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, hoping to spark a slave uprising. He was captured and hanged, but to many in the North, he became a martyr. To the South, a warning that their way of life was under attack. In a decade, the political center collapsed. Debates in Congress turned into fistfights. Newspapers spoke of disunion as a real possibility. The moral and constitutional compromises that had bound the Union together were fraying beyond repair. February 1860. A tall lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln debates Senator Stephen Douglas, insisting that a house divided against itself cannot stand. Torches flare at nighttime rallies as the nation edges toward an election that will decide whether it breaks apart in words or in war. April 12, 1861. At dawn, Confederate guns roar across Charleston Harbor. Shells arc toward Fort Sumter, a lonely federal outpost flying the U.S. flag. The bombardment lasts 34 hours. When the garrison finally surrenders, church bells ring in both North and South, some in celebration, others in dread. The Civil War has begun. 11 Southern states seceded after the election of Abraham Lincoln, convinced that a Republican president meant the end of slavery's expansion. The new Confederate States of America, led by Jefferson Davis, claimed it was defending states' rights. At the core was the right to hold human beings as property. Lincoln at first framed the conflict as a struggle to preserve the Union. But as the war deepened, after the bloody summer of 1862, he came to see that the Union could not be saved without destroying slavery. His Emancipation Proclamation of January 1, 1863, declared enslaved people in rebel territory free and opened the Army's ranks to black soldiers who would fight for their own liberation. The war was the first industrial-scale conflict in American history. Railroads rushed troops to distant fronts. The telegraph carried orders and news in hours instead of weeks. Mass-produced rifles and cannon turned battles into slaughters. Key turning points changed the war's tide. At Gettysburg in July 1863, Union troops repelled Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North. That autumn, at a cemetery on the battlefield, Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address, redefining the war as a test of a new birth of freedom. In 1864 to 1865, General William Tecumseh Sherman's march through Georgia and the Carolinas shattered the South's capacity to fight. On April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. 5 days later, in Ford's Theater, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, leaving the work of reunion unfinished. The war cost more than 600,000 lives, more Americans than all the nation's other wars of the 19th century combined. But it also remade the Constitution. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, beginning what many call a second founding of the United States. At sunrise on a battered Richmond street, newly freed men and women watch Union troops march in with torn but upright flags. The war for Union has become a war for freedom, yet the question of how to build that freedom in peace still lies ahead. May 1865. In Charleston, South Carolina, newly freed men and women walk in a solemn parade to honor Union soldiers buried in hastily dug graves. They lay flowers and sing hymns of freedom. For a brief moment, the future seems open. An America rebuilt on liberty for all. The Civil War had destroyed slavery, but not the social order built upon it. The task of Reconstruction was to bind the Union back together and define the meaning of freedom for 4 million emancipated people. At first, Congress and the new President Andrew Johnson clashed. Johnson, a Southern Unionist, wanted rapid restoration of the old states with minimal changes. Former Confederate leaders quickly returned to power and passed black codes, restricting the rights of the freed. Outraged, the Republican-dominated Congress seized control of Reconstruction. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment, granting citizenship and equal protection under the law. Under the protection of Union troops, freedmen voted, held office, and built schools and churches, a remarkable flowering of black political and civic life. But white supremacist violence rose in answer. Secret societies like the Ku Klux Klan used night-riding terror, whippings, lynchings, burned homes to break the new order. Federal enforcement acts tried to curb the violence, but Northern resolve waned. The economic crash of 1873, scandals in Washington, and growing racial fatigue in the North eroded support for military occupation of the South, when the presidential election of 1876 ended in dispute. The Compromise of 1877 resolved it by awarding the White House to Rutherford B. Hayes in exchange for withdrawing federal troops from the South. In the aftermath, Southern states quickly imposed Jim Crow laws, disenfranchising black voters and enforcing segregation. The promise of equal citizenship was rolled back for nearly a century. Reconstruction proved that liberty could advance only when backed by political will and protection. Its failure left a deep scar, one that would shape the long civil rights struggle to come. On the steps of a shuttered Freedmen's Bureau schoolhouse, a black teacher gathers her few remaining books as armed men ride by in the dusk. The dream of an interracial democracy flickers but does not die, waiting for another generation to take it up again. July 1877. In Martinsburg, West Virginia, railroad workers, unpaid and hungry, block the tracks. Federal troops arrive with bayonets fixed, shots ring out, men fall. The first great national labor strike has begun. The Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain, described a nation glittering with wealth on the surface, but scarred by inequality beneath. In the wake of Reconstruction's collapse, the United States turned its energy toward industrial expansion. Steel from Andrew Carnegie's mills built bridges and skyscrapers. Oil refined by John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil lit homes and lubricated machines. Railroads stretched across the continent, binding together distant cities and farmland, moving wheat from Kansas and coal from Pennsylvania to eastern ports and foreign markets. But the new economy came at a cost. Workdays were long, conditions harsh, wages often meager. Strikes, like the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Haymarket Affair of 1886, and the Bloody Homestead Strike of 1892, pitted workers against both private militias and state troops. Meanwhile, millions of immigrants, Italians, Poles, Russians, Chinese, poured into booming cities like New York and Chicago, building rail lines, digging canals, laboring in sweatshops. The cities grew upward and outward, tenements for the poor, brownstones for the middle class, glittering mansions for the new barons of industry. The government often sided with business, granting land to railroads and using courts to block union organizing. Yet reformers, writers, and journalists, the muckrakers, exposed child labor, tenement squalor, and political machines that traded votes for favors. Farmers in the Midwest formed the populist movement, demanding fair railroad rates and the coinage of silver to ease debts. In the South, black citizens faced systematic disenfranchisement and racial terror, even as they built schools, newspapers, and churches under constant threat. Native nations in the West were confined to reservations after wars on the plains, culminating in the 1890 massacre at Wounded Knee, ending armed indigenous resistance. The Gilded Age forged the modern American economy, rail-linked, factory-driven, corporate-led, while sharpening class divides and leaving unhealed the racial wounds of slavery's aftermath. At night in Pittsburgh, molten steel pours from an open hearth furnace, throwing a red glow over the faces of exhausted workers. In the distance, the whistle of a train carries across the river, a sound of progress to some, of relentless toil to others. America is learning that the wealth of an age can gild the surface while leaving the foundations cracked. May 10, 1869. At Promontory Summit, Utah, a ceremonial golden spike is driven to connect the Central Pacific and Union Pacific railroads. A telegraph click flashes the news coast to coast. The first transcontinental railroad is complete. For many Americans, it is the triumph of progress. For others, the Plains tribes, it is the iron road that will pierce their world. The decades after the Civil War saw the frontier transformed. Railroads stitched together oceans and prairies, carrying settlers, cattle, wheat, and ore. Towns sprang up along the tracks almost overnight. Immigrants from Europe and Asia joined freedmen and eastern farmers in a westward surge. The Federal Homestead Act offered land to those willing to work it, while timber, coal, and silver lured prospectors and corporations alike. For native nations, this boom meant relentless pressure and dispossession. Treaties signed in solemn ceremony were repeatedly broken as settlers and prospectors poured onto reserved lands. The great buffalo herds, lifeblood of the Plains tribes, were slaughtered by hunters and by the advance of railroads, nearly to extinction. Resistance flared. The Lakota Sioux, led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, defeated Custer's 7th Cavalry at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, one of the few indigenous victories that slowed but could not stop U.S. expansion. The government responded with overwhelming force, compelling most tribes onto reservations. The final tragedy came in December 1890 at Wounded Knee Creek, South Dakota. There, U.S. troops surrounded a camp of Lakota, performing the Ghost Dance, a desperate spiritual movement promising restoration of their lands. A shot was fired, no one knows by whom, and soldiers opened fire with rifles and a Hotchkiss gun. Hundreds of men, women, and children were killed in the snow. That same year, the superintendent of the census declared the frontier officially closed. No clear line separated settled from unsettled land. The winning of the West was also the destruction of native sovereignty and lifeways. The nation's expansion was achieved not only by rails and plows, but by war, disease, and forced removal. On a quiet plain beneath the Dakota sky, a Lakota elder lays tobacco on the frozen ground at Wounded Knee. Far to the east, in Chicago's stockyards, cattle from the same plains are driven into chutes under the shadow of new steel towers. The frontier has been claimed, but the cost is written in blood and memory. February 15, 1898. In Havana Harbor, the U.S. battleship Maine erupts in a fireball. 260 sailors perish. Newspaper headlines scream, "Remember the Maine." Across the United States, public outrage surges, a cry for war and for a new kind of power. By the late 19th century, the United States had filled the continent. Industrial might and a growing navy now pushed leaders to look outward. Businessmen dreamed of overseas markets. Strategists called for coaling stations and bases. Missionaries spoke of spreading Christianity and civilization. The idea of imperial reach, long resisted in a republic born in anti-colonial revolt, was gaining ground. The war with Spain in 1898 became the nation's imperial turning point. In a brief, dramatic conflict, U.S. forces seized Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean and, across the Pacific, defeated Spain's fleet in Manila Bay. The Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island came under U.S. control. Though Cuba gained nominal independence, American troops and capital dominated its politics. In the Philippines, however, conquest bled into counterinsurgency. For 3 years, Filipino revolutionaries under Emilio Aguinaldo fought bitterly for their own independence. The war claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, many from famine and disease. At home, critics like Mark Twain and the Anti-Imperialist League warned that empire abroad betrayed the nation's founding ideals. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean and Central America, Washington asserted a new role as regional policeman. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine justified interventions in Latin American nations to protect U.S. interests and to keep European powers out. The most dramatic achievement was the construction of the Panama Canal, 1904 to 1914, linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and reshaping world trade. These years also saw the United States flexing diplomatic and military muscle in the Pacific and Asia, mediating the Russo-Japanese War and annexing Hawaii. The United States had stepped onto the world stage as an empire in all but name, combining democratic rhetoric with colonial control. The tensions between ideals and ambitions, so long domestic, now played out on a global scale. A US flag flutters above the newly cut locks of the Panama Canal as a steamship glides through, horn bellowing. Half a world away, in a Philippine village, a schoolteacher writes the alphabet on a chalkboard beneath a portrait of President Roosevelt. The Republic has crossed the ocean, bringing both promise and dominion. March 25, 1911. Flames leap from the upper floors of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City. Dozens of young immigrant women trapped behind locked doors leap to their deaths as horrified crowds watch from the streets below. The tragedy shocks the nation and ignites demands for reform. At the dawn of the 20th century, the United States was an industrial giant, its cities crowded, its factories roaring, its society riven by inequality. Many believed the promise of the Republic was being corrupted by unrestrained corporations, urban poverty, and political machines. The era's answer was progressivism, a diverse movement seeking to harness government power to tame the excesses of capitalism and widen democracy. Muckraking journalists such as Ida Tarbell exposed the monopolistic practices of Standard Oil. Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle revealed the horrors of Chicago's meatpacking plants, prompting federal food safety laws. Reformers fought child labor, demanded shorter working hours, and campaigned for safer factories and tenement housing. In the White House, Theodore Roosevelt embraced the idea of the federal government as a steward of the people. He broke up powerful trusts, mediated labor disputes, and championed the conservation of wilderness, setting aside millions of acres for national parks and forests. His successor, William Howard Taft, continued antitrust actions, but split with Roosevelt over pace and priorities, leading to the creation of a new, progressive party. Woodrow Wilson, elected in 1912, pushed through sweeping financial reforms, the Federal Reserve System, a progressive income tax, and new laws to regulate business and protect workers. Meanwhile, grassroots activists, especially women, such as Jane Addams and the leaders of the suffrage movement, expanded settlement houses, social work, and campaigns for the vote. African Americans, excluded from many reforms and facing rising segregation and racial violence, began to organize more forcefully under leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois, who co-founded the NAACP in 1909. The progressive era showed that democracy could adapt to an industrial age, using law, investigation, and civic action to confront concentrated power. Yet its benefits were uneven, often bypassing communities of color and immigrant workers. In a Washington, D.C. street parade, suffragists in white dresses march past the Capitol, carrying banners for the vote. Behind them, the smoke of factory chimneys curls into the spring sky. America is learning that progress is not a gift of time, but the result of struggle. May 7, 1915. Off the coast of Ireland, a German U-boat torpedoes the British liner Lusitania. Nearly 1,200 passengers die, including more than 100 Americans. Newspapers across the United States fill with black-bordered headlines. Yet President Woodrow Wilson resists the clamor for war, still hoping to keep America neutral. For nearly 3 years after the outbreak of World War I in Europe, the United States remained officially neutral. Trade with Britain and France boomed, while German submarine attacks strained public patience. Wilson won re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Then in early 1917, two shocks tipped the scales. First, Germany announced unrestricted submarine warfare, threatening all shipping to Allied ports. Then British intelligence revealed the Zimmermann telegram, a secret German proposal urging Mexico to join the war against the United States in exchange for the return of lost territories. On April 2, 1917, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war, proclaiming the world must be made safe for democracy. American factories switched to war production. Millions of men were drafted. Women entered the workforce in new numbers. A propaganda campaign rallied support while curbing dissent. The arrival of more than 2 million fresh American expeditionary forces led by General John J. Pershing tipped the balance on the Western Front. In the summer and autumn of 1918, U.S. troops helped halt Germany's last offensive, and push the exhausted Central Powers toward collapse. The armistice of November 11, 1918, ended the fighting. Wilson traveled to Europe to promote his 14 points and a vision of a League of Nations to prevent future wars. But at home, a weary and suspicious Senate rejected the treaty, refusing to commit the United States to permanent international obligations. The post-war years brought a wave of turmoil. A deadly influenza pandemic killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. Strikes and inflation fed unrest. Fears of Bolshevism triggered the Red Scare, with raids on radicals and immigrants. The optimism of Wilson's wartime rhetoric gave way to disillusionment. The United States emerged as a world power with global reach, but also learned that victory abroad did not guarantee peace or unity at home. In the chill dawn of November 11th, an American bugler sounds taps over a quiet battlefield in France. Half a world away in Kansas, a school bell rings over a town struck by influenza. The nation that had promised to make the world safe for democracy now faces the challenge of safeguarding its own. October 29, 1929. Inside a crowded New York brokerage, the stock ticker clatters and then falters as the numbers plunge. A broker buries his face in his hands. Outside, on Wall Street, stunned crowds gather beneath falling paper. The decade of jazz, fast cars, and easy credit has slammed into the wall of history. The 1920s began in a blaze of novelty. The United States emerged from World War I richer and more confident. Cities swelled, radios and phonographs spread music and news, cars poured off Henry Ford's assembly lines. In a single decade, more Americans lived in towns and cities than on farms. Women celebrated a new freedom. The 19th Amendment, 1920, gave them the vote. Flappers bobbed their hair and danced the Charleston in smoky jazz clubs. African Americans carried the rhythms of the South northward during the Great Migration, transforming neighborhoods like Harlem into a cultural capital of music, poetry, and politics. But the decade's brightness hid deep shadows. Prohibition, banning the sale of alcohol, spawned speakeasies and empowered gangsters such as Al Capone. Immigration quotas targeted Southern and Eastern Europeans. The Ku Klux Klan revived, marching by the tens of thousands in Washington, D.C. Farmers, left behind by the boom, sank under falling crop prices. The stock market became the era's symbol and trap. Easy credit and speculation drove share prices ever upward until the bubble burst in October 1929. Banks failed, savings vanished, factories shut down, unemployment soared to 25%. Shanty towns of the homeless, mockingly called Hoovervilles, sprang up on city outskirts. President Herbert Hoover, cautious and committed to limited government, struggled to stem the collapse. Bread lines lengthened. The Dust Bowl, drought, and soil erosion across the Great Plains drove farm families westward in search of work and hope. The Roaring Twenties revealed both the possibilities of modern consumer society and its fragility. When prosperity rested on speculation rather than stability, a single shock could bring the whole edifice down. In a Harlem nightclub, a trumpet's bright note fades as lights dim for lack of paying customers. Across the continent in California, a family's jalopy grinds westward over a dusty road. The promise of an age of endless growth has given way to the fear of breadlines and foreclosure. March 4th, 1933. The nation is paralyzed by fear, banks collapsing, factories silent, farms in foreclosure. In Washington, a new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, steps to the podium for his inaugural address. "The only thing we have to fear," he declares, "is fear itself." Millions of anxious listeners cling to their radios as if to a lifeline. The Great Depression had struck every corner of America. 1 in 4 workers was unemployed. Dust storms scoured the plains. Hungry men sold apples on street corners. Confidence in government was shattered. Roosevelt moved quickly to restore it. In his first 100 days, Congress passed a surge of laws. The Emergency Banking Act reopened stable banks. The FDIC guaranteed deposits. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, put young men to work planting forests and building trails. The Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, built dams that electrified and modernized a poor rural region. Through his fireside chats, Roosevelt spoke directly to the people, explaining policies in plain words and urging calm. The New Deal became both a set of programs and a new expectation that the federal government had a duty to protect citizens from economic catastrophe. Labor won new rights under the Wagner Act. The Social Security Act 1935 created pensions for the elderly and unemployment insurance for the jobless. Artists and writers found support in the WPA, which funded murals, oral histories, and public buildings, turning recovery into a cultural moment as well as an economic one. Yet the New Deal had limits. Southern lawmakers ensured that many black and brown farm workers and domestics were excluded from key benefits. Women entered the workforce in greater numbers but often in the lowest paid jobs. Despite reforms, a deep recession struck again in 1937, before war production finally pulled the economy fully out of depression. The New Deal redefined the relationship between Americans and their government, embedding the idea that Washington could act as a guarantor of social and economic security. It also left unresolved the question of how far that duty extended across lines of race and class. In the Great Smoky Mountains, CCC recruits in canvas uniforms plant saplings along a new park trail as a ranger looks on. In a tenement kitchen in Chicago, a mother counts the few dollars from her first Social Security check. The nation has begun to rebuild its faith in government, in work, and in tomorrow. December 7th, 1941. Dawn over Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Japanese planes dive out of the clouds, torpedoes slice the water, flames roar from burning battleships. By noon, more than 2,400 Americans are dead. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt calls it a date which will live in infamy, and Congress declares war. The United States has entered World War II. Even before Pearl Harbor, the United States had been edging toward involvement. The fall of France in 1940 and the Battle of Britain convinced many that Nazi Germany threatened the entire world order. Roosevelt, re-elected to an unprecedented third term, pledged America would be the arsenal of democracy, sending Lend-Lease aid, ships, planes, food to Britain and the Soviet Union. Once at war, the United States mobilized on a scale unprecedented in its history. Factories retooled overnight. Detroit's car plants built tanks and bombers. Shipyards launched new vessels almost weekly. Women by the millions joined the workforce as Rosie the Riveter. African-American workers moved north and west into war industries, pressing for both victory abroad and civil rights at home. On the battlefronts, the conflict ranged across continents. In the Pacific, after early defeats in the Philippines, U.S. forces turned the tide at Midway 1942 and fought island to island toward Japan. In North Africa and Europe, U.S. troops landed first in Morocco and Algeria, then in Sicily and Italy, before storming the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944. In the east, the Red Army bore the main burden of fighting Germany, while American and British air forces bombed German cities and war industries. By spring 1945, Allied armies closed in on Germany from east and west. Hitler took his own life as Berlin fell. In the Pacific, after the bloody battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, President Harry Truman, who had succeeded the dying Roosevelt, authorized the use of a new weapon, the atomic bomb, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Japan surrendered days later. The war ended the Depression, forged a vast military-industrial complex, and elevated the United States to the status of global superpower. It also left the world haunted by the destructive power of nuclear weapons. In New York Harbor, as the war ends, sailors toss their hats in the air while the Statue of Liberty glints in the sunlight. Half a world away, on a quiet Pacific island, a lone Marine lowers the flag over an abandoned bunker. The arsenal of democracy has prevailed, but the peace it ushered in will prove fragile. June 1948. In the ruins of post-war Berlin, Soviet troops seal the roads and rail lines to the western sectors. Children press their faces to barbed wire fences, watching as U.S. cargo planes, Candy bombers, drop food and coal from the sky. The Berlin airlift becomes the first dramatic test of a new era, the Cold War. World War II ended with the United States and the Soviet Union as the world's two superpowers, bound by wartime alliance, divided by ideology. America championed free market democracy. The USSR claimed the banner of revolutionary socialism. Between them stretched an iron curtain of Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe. In 1947, President Harry Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, pledging U.S. support to nations resisting communist expansion. The Marshall Plan poured billions into rebuilding Western Europe's economies and binding them to the democratic camp. In 1949, NATO was formed as a military alliance. The Soviets countered with the Warsaw Pact. At home, the early Cold War brought both prosperity and anxiety. Returning veterans used the GI Bill to buy homes and attend college. Suburbs blossomed and highways spread. Yet fears of espionage and subversion, fueled by events like the Soviet atomic bomb test, 1949, and the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, spurred loyalty oaths, blacklists in Hollywood, and hearings led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, whose televised accusations destroyed careers before his tactics were exposed. In the 1950s, the Cold War went global. The US fought in Korea, where a bloody stalemate ended in 1953 with the peninsula still divided. Both sides built vast nuclear arsenals, testing hydrogen bombs and practicing civil defense drills under the shadow of mushroom clouds. The space race began when the USSR launched Sputnik, 1957, prompting the US to pour resources into science and technology. Amid the rivalry abroad, the United States confronted a long-delayed reckoning at home. The Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, decision struck down segregation in public schools. In Montgomery, Alabama, a quiet seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat, sparking a year-long boycott led by a young pastor, Martin Luther King Jr. The civil rights struggle exposed the gap between American ideals and its practices before a global audience. The Cold War shaped not only foreign policy but also domestic life, spurring scientific advances and economic growth while stoking fear and curbing dissent. It also forced the nation to confront whether it could lead the free world while denying freedom to many of its own citizens. October 1962. In the Oval Office, President John F. Kennedy studies reconnaissance photos of Soviet missiles in Cuba as Navy ships form a blockade. For 13 tense days, the world teeters on the brink of nuclear war, proof that the contest begun in Berlin could now decide the fate of the planet. December 1st, 1955. Montgomery, Alabama. A city bus driver orders a tired seamstress to give up her seat to a white passenger. Rosa Parks refuses. Her arrest sparks a 381-day bus boycott that will echo far beyond one southern city. The struggle for black equality had been building since the end of Reconstruction, but now entered a decisive phase. The Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954 declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional. Southern leaders vowed massive resistance, closing schools rather than integrating them. Families and children became the front line in a national moral contest. Under the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr., the Montgomery bus boycott proved the power of non-violent protest, organizing churches, carpools, and mass meetings to challenge injustice without returning violence for violence. It became a model for a wider movement. The 1960s unfolded as a decade of confrontation and courage. Student sit-ins at lunch counters in Greensboro spread across the South. Freedom riders tested federal orders to desegregate buses, enduring beatings and burning buses. In Birmingham in 1963, police used fire hoses and dogs on young demonstrators, images that shocked the world. That August, 250,000 Americans gathered at the March on Washington, where King declared, "I have a dream," beneath the statue of Lincoln. President Lyndon B. Johnson, after John F. Kennedy's assassination, used the nation's outrage and his own political skill to push through landmark legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation in public accommodations. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 struck down literacy tests and other barriers that had kept millions of black citizens from the ballot box. Yet progress came at a terrible price. 4 young girls were killed in the bombing of Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church. Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King Jr. were all assassinated. Urban uprisings in Watts, Detroit, and Newark revealed the persistence of poverty and discrimination beyond the South. The civil rights movement reshaped American democracy, proving that grassroots activism and moral witness could force the nation to fulfill its own founding promises, but it also exposed enduring racial and economic inequalities that law alone could not solve. April 4, 1968, Memphis, Tennessee. As the sun sets over the Lorraine Motel, news spreads that Dr. King has been shot. Across the country, candles are lit in sorrow and resolve, proof that the long march for justice has not ended, but entered a new, uncertain chapter. August 2, 1964, off the coast of North Vietnam, U.S. destroyer Maddox reports coming under attack. The incident, later revealed to be murky, becomes the spark for a vast escalation. Within months, American combat troops land in Southeast Asia, beginning the nation's longest and most divisive war to that date. In the mid-1960s, the optimism of the civil rights victories gave way to the turbulence of the Vietnam War and domestic upheaval. Presidents Lyndon B. Johnson and later Richard Nixon sent ever larger forces to fight the communist-led Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. By the late 1960s, more than 500,000 Americans were deployed in a conflict fought in jungles and on television screens. Nightly newscasts brought home images of burning villages and flag-draped coffins. The Tet Offensive of January 1968, a massive surprise attack by communist forces, shocked the American public and eroded trust in government assurances of imminent victory. At home, campuses erupted in protest. The anti-war movement merged with calls for racial justice, women's liberation, and youth counterculture. Flower children clashing with riot police outside the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. Assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy that same year deepened the sense of a nation coming apart. Richard Nixon won the 1968 election promising law and order and a secret plan for peace. His administration expanded the war into Cambodia, even as it pursued negotiations. The conflict finally ended in 1973 with the Paris Peace Accords and the withdrawal of U.S. troops. 2 years later, Saigon fell to North Vietnamese forces, unifying the country under communism. Even as the war wound down, Nixon's presidency was consumed by the Watergate scandal. A break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in 1972 led to revelations of illegal wiretaps, hush money, and abuse of power. Televised congressional hearings captivated the nation. Faced with certain impeachment, Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974, the first U.S. president to do so. The Vietnam era shattered post-war faith in government and demonstrated the limits of American military power abroad. The Watergate crisis showed that the constitutional system could still hold leaders accountable. April 1975. As U.S. helicopters lift desperate evacuees from the rooftop of the Saigon embassy, a generation of Americans watches in anguish on live TV. A year later, in a solemn Capitol ceremony, Gerald Ford declares that our long national nightmare is over. But the wounds of war and scandal linger. January 20th, 1981. Under a bright winter sky, newly sworn-in President Ronald Reagan declares that government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. As he speaks, news flashes that American hostages in Iran, held for 444 days, have just been released. A weary nation senses a turn of the tide. The mid-1970s had left Americans disillusioned. The Vietnam defeat, the Watergate scandal, an economy stifled by stagflation, and a crisis of confidence under President Jimmy Carter. Reagan, a former actor and California governor, offered a message of renewal. Morning in America. His administration cut taxes, loosened regulations, and increased military spending in a bid to revive growth and confront the Soviet Union. Supporters credited Reaganomics and the Federal Reserve's tight money policies with taming runaway inflation. Critics saw rising deficits and widening inequality. Reagan's hardline abroad branded the USSR the evil empire. The the United States escalated the arms race with new missiles and a proposed strategic defense initiative, Star Wars. Yet the decade also brought a thaw. In the mid-1980s, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduced reforms, glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Summit meetings in Geneva, Reykjavik, and Washington led to landmark arms reduction treaties and a gradual easing of Cold War tensions. At home, the 1980s were an age of contrasts. A surging tech and finance sector reshaped the economy and culture. Conservative politics clashed with movements for women's rights, LGBTQ visibility, and racial equality. The crack cocaine epidemic and the HIV/AIDS crisis exposed sharp social divides. Immigration from Latin America and Asia reshaped the nation's demographics. The Cold War itself reached a dramatic climax as Soviet influence crumbled in Eastern Europe. In 1989, jubilant Berliners swung hammers at the Berlin Wall, long a concrete symbol of division. By 1991, the Soviet Union had dissolved. The United States stood as the world's sole superpower. Reagan's era blended free market revivalism and patriotic optimism with the strains of inequality and culture war politics. The peaceful end of the Cold War brought hope but also new uncertainties about America's role in a unipolar world. December 25, 1991. As the red Soviet flag is lowered for the last time over the Kremlin, US viewers watch on live television. In Times Square that night, the neon glow reflects off the faces of celebrating crowds. An old rivalry ended, a new age beginning. September 11th, 2001. A commercial jetliner slices through the clear New York sky and crashes into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Minutes later, a second plane hits the South Tower. Live on television, the towers collapse in thunder and smoke. The world watches in disbelief as the United States is struck on its own soil. The end of the Cold War had opened a brief season of unrivaled American power. The 1990s saw new hopes for global peace and prosperity. Under President George H.W. Bush, US-led forces expelled Iraq from Kuwait in the Gulf War, 1991, showcasing advanced technology and quick victory. At home, the economy surged with the dot-com boom, the internet transforming communication, commerce, and culture. Silicon Valley startups minted billionaires overnight. President Bill Clinton's years brought budget surpluses, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and the rise of globalized supply chains. Yet partisan battles, culture war debates, and the scandal leading to Clinton's impeachment revealed a nation still divided beneath the glow of prosperity. The optimism of the 1990s shattered on 9/11. The attacks planned by al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden killed nearly 3,000 people and stunned the nation. President George W. Bush declared a global war on terror. Within weeks, US forces toppled the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which had harbored al-Qaeda. 2 years later, the United States invaded Iraq, 2003, on the claim, never proven, that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. The quick military victories gave way to prolonged insurgencies, sectarian violence, and mounting US casualties. At home, new security measures, the Patriot Act, airport screening, intelligence sharing, expanded federal power, and sparked debates over privacy and civil liberties. The early 2000s also witnessed deep political polarization as cable news and the internet amplified partisan voices. Meanwhile, the late 1990s tech stock bubble burst in 2000, wiping out fortunes. Recovery was slow, then shaken again by the rising costs of war, and by 2007 to 2008, by the subprime mortgage crisis and the near collapse of global financial markets. Era in sight. The period after the Cold War promised a new global order under US leadership, but instead revealed the vulnerability of even the strongest nation, to terrorism, to financial speculation, and to the limits of military power. Closing cinematic beat. A lone spotlight now illuminates the two empty pools at Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan as evening crowds gather in silence. Across the continent in Silicon Valley, the glow of computer screens heralds a new era of technology and connectivity. an age of opportunity shadowed by insecurity. January 20th, 2009. On the steps of the US Capitol, before a sea of flags and cheering crowds, Barack Obama takes the oath of office as the nation's first black president. Behind the jubilation lies crisis, banks failing, millions losing homes to wars still raging. A campaign of hope and change now confronts the hardest of realities. The Great Recession, 2008 to 2009, triggered by the collapse of the housing bubble and reckless financial practices, wiped out trillions in household wealth. Obama's administration moved quickly with a massive stimulus package to halt the slide and rescue major banks and automakers. By mid-decade, the economy had recovered, though unevenly. Many working-class families never regained what they lost. In 2010, Congress passed the Affordable Care Act, expanding health insurance to millions, but igniting fierce partisan resistance. The Tea Party movement rose in backlash, mobilizing anger over taxes, spending, and social change. Congressional gridlock deepened. Abroad, US forces withdrew from Iraq, even as the Arab Spring toppled dictators and new conflicts erupted. The raid that killed Osama bin Laden in 2011 was a symbolic triumph, yet wars in Afghanistan and Syria dragged on. At home, the killings of unarmed black Americans such as Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and Eric Garner sparked the Black Lives Matter movement, revealing enduring racial injustice and fueling nationwide protests. The election of Donald Trump in 2016 marked a dramatic turn. Running on a populist nationalist message, "Make America Great Again," he won the presidency by channeling economic discontent and cultural backlash. His years in office saw deepening polarization, sharp immigration crackdowns, a contentious Supreme Court reshaping, growing distrust of media and institutions, and impeachment proceedings over alleged abuse of power. Technology and social media accelerated these divides, creating echo chambers of information and fueling disinformation. The 2010s became a decade in which the optimism of the early internet age collided with the politics of outrage. By 2020, the nation faced a convergence of crises: a bitterly contested presidential election, a resurgent racial justice movement after the killing of George Floyd, and, just as the campaign heated up, an unfolding global pandemic. The period from the Great Recession to 2020 showed that hope could electrify and mobilize a nation, but also that backlash and mistrust could fracture its civic life. American democracy entered the third decade of the 21st century, more diverse, more technologically connected, yet more divided than at any time since the Civil War. November 2020. Amid a pandemic and unprecedented voter turnout, ballots are tallied late into the night. In homes lit by TV screens and smartphones, Americans watch an anxious, polarized nation struggle again over what kind of republic it wants to be. April 2020. In New York, Times Square stands eerily silent beneath glowing billboards. Ambulance sirens echo off shuttered storefronts as masked nurses hurry through deserted streets. A microscopic virus has slowed the mightiest economy on Earth to a hush. The COVID-19 pandemic struck the United States with a force unseen in a century. Hospitals overflowed, supply chains buckled, millions lost jobs as entire industries shut down. By the end of 2020, hundreds of thousands of Americans had died. The crisis exposed stark inequalities in healthcare, housing, and work. That same year, the killing of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer ignited the largest wave of civil rights protests since the 1960s. Millions marched in cities and small towns demanding racial justice and police reform. Statues fell, streets filled with murals, and once quiet conversations about systemic racism reached the political mainstream. The 2020 presidential election, held amid the pandemic, broke turnout records but also deepened polarization. Mail-in ballots and delayed counts fueled conspiracy theories. In January 2021, as Congress met to certify the vote, a violent mob stormed the US Capitol, a shock to the nation's image of its own democratic stability. The new administration under Joe Biden faced the triple challenge of pandemic recovery, political division, and an intensifying climate crisis. marked by megafires, hurricanes, and record heat. Mass vaccination campaigns, trillions in relief spending, and new infrastructure and climate laws began to reshape priorities, yet mistrust in institutions persisted. Globally, the United States confronted a changed strategic landscape. A rising China, a resurgent Russia, whose invasion of Ukraine in 2022 revived Cold War-era tensions, tested U.S. alliances. Cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and the rapid advance of artificial intelligence and green energy technologies redefined what national security means. At home, cultural battles over voting rights, immigration, gender, and history itself continued to roil politics, amplified by social media algorithms and 24-hour news cycles. The 2020s revealed that America's challenges are no longer just military or economic, they are also biological, environmental, technological, and civic. The nation's strength rests not only on power abroad, but on trust, cohesion, and adaptability at home. A drone camera rises over the National Mall at dusk as lights glow around a solemn memorial to pandemic victims. Beyond the monuments, the Capitol dome gleams against the evening sky, a reminder that the American experiment, tested again and again, continues to be written in each generation's response to crisis. From the forests of the Atlantic coast to the high plains and the far Pacific, the story of the United States has been less a straight line than a river, sometimes calm, sometimes in flood, always reshaped by the land it crosses and the people who steer it. In 400 years, the nation has been born from revolution, sundered by slavery, reforged in civil war, transformed by immigration, challenged by depression, galvanized by world wars, and redefined by struggles for equality and freedom. Each era believed itself the culmination of the American idea. Each learned that history moves onward, demanding fresh choices. The United States has shown that democracy is not a fixed inheritance, but an ongoing act of collective will. Its greatest leaps, independence, emancipation, civil rights, have often come at the moments when its contradictions became too glaring to ignore. Its deepest wounds, racism, inequality, political violence, have returned in new forms whenever the lessons of the past were set aside. The arc of this history reveals a paradox. Power has grown immense, yet the fate of the Republic has always turned on the courage of individuals, abolitionists and suffragists, soldiers and teachers, inventors and voters. The experiment endures because new generations continue to take up the unfinished work. As the 21st century unfolds, America's challenges, climate, technology, inequality, global competition, are not smaller than those of the past, but neither are the opportunities for renewal. The lesson of history is not that progress is inevitable, but that it is possible when citizens insist that the nation live up to its ideals. The river flows onward, and the next bend is always unseen. What remains constant is the choice of those in the boat, how to steer. Dawn over the Potomac, the Capitol dome bathed in first light, the Lincoln Memorial reflected in still water, the sounds of a distant city waking. A new day for a story still being written.